Welcome everybody to our talk about Mrc compression, OCR, JBIG2 and other technologies for converting scanned documents and actually other input types to PDF and PDF-A. My name is Armin Ortmann. I'm the CTO of LuraTech. You're probably familiar with our company. We have been in the PDF area for quite a while, and our original domain was scanned PDF, but we have meanwhile expanded a bit, and so I'll cover a few adjoining areas as well. That gives you an overview of where we come from and where we're aiming to move. Originally, we supported a lot of converting scanned paper to PDF-A, so you have scan service providers or big industrial companies who have huge archives and huge amounts of incoming paper and basically want to convert them to PDF or preferably to PDF-A for long-term archiving and accessibility. Our domain comes from, or our origins are in image compression, and so we do a lot of Mrc compression, which I'll explain briefly soon. And in that process involved, we are using the JBIG2 and JPEG200 image compression codecs, which are also part of the ISO PDF standard. Along with compressing documents, when you're working from scanned documents, we recommend and we offer doing OCR. We're not developing our own OCR, but we're using third-party components. And on the side, we can also take existing PDFs, that's the so-called PDF optimization, and we'll try to take out redundancies, try to streamline and apply some modifications to make PDFs smaller and more accessible, for example, for web download. Additionally, these days, we are more and more confronted with the task of so-called born digital conversion, that is converting Office documents, emails, HTML, and some other files such as MS Project or MS Visio files or CAD files to PDF, or again, preferably to PDF-A for long-term archiving. People are aware that certain types of viewers may change or may go away, and in terms of archiving everything in the shape of PDF-A, they would like to convert those documents, which of course comes with its own intricacies. For example, what the print representation of an Excel spreadsheet is may vary according to your page setup, may also vary according to certain formulas or macros evaluated within the Excel spreadsheet. So it's sometimes more tricky than just converting scanned pages. And we also move into the area of embedding documents, which has been part of the PDF-A2 standard and has now been expanded in the PDF-A3 standard. I'll only give very quick or mention this very briefly, as Mr. Wild will also really talk about it in depth, this Zugpferd standard for electronic invoice embedding, which is now being promoted in Germany. And as a synthesis of all these tasks, we are now aiming at making better decisions automatically. With these more diverse input types, users are these days confronted with more and more detailed decisions, which we think we can automate and which we actually should automate to take complexity away from the users or to unburden them. So for the Mrc compression concepts, many of you have probably heard this before, but I'll only just briefly introduce it. So in the middle here, you do have an example document that has a big image and some colored text. And what we basically have is an algorithm that segments this image into these three types of information that you see on the right here. So you can imagine this as three layers which are put over each other in the actual PDF document, which of course takes advantage of transparency in the PDF standard which of course requires readers to compose this image back again properly, which can be tricky at some points, and therefore I'll make mention of that later on as well. And for each of those 3 layers, we are using the kind of optimal compression algorithm. So for the color layers on top and on the bottom, we would use JPEG200, and for this text type layer in the middle, we would use JBIG2. Again, the 3 layers here in some more detail. The top layer is also called the foreground or text color layer. The text or mask layer, this one usually contains most of the information on a page. If a page has written text, most of the text will appear in this layer, which is a strictly bitonal layer. So it's only 1 or 0, black or white, on or off. And it actually works as a kind of stencil. So you can imagine this put as a stencil on that background layer, which really contains the page background, and thank you, and all the images on the page. And you would put this on as a stencil and then basically print the color here through these character openings, so to speak, onto that page, and that's what you essentially get. And since, of course, the information in these top and bottom layers is greatly reduced, they can be compressed very efficiently with JPEG200. So all these white or more or less white areas, as you may have a scan page where it's not actually white but slightly yellowish or grayish or slightly speckled, all of that would be compressed to a very small portion of data. And what I've mentioned here as well is that within the PDF standards there are alternatives. So you don't have to use JPEG200, you can use JPEG, but it has, of course, a little less efficient compression. And again, the same holds for FAXG4 instead of JBIG2.
I don't know whether you have it. If you have a look at the parts, then JPEG2000 requires PDF-A part 2.
That's on
Next
like
slide.
2 slides from now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Just a quick real-world example. That's what those layers would really look like for that document. That's really created from our software. So you see the segmentation would leave a little residue of the characters on the background page. It would segment out the entire image. And here, as this is created on the fly, and you don't have any beforehand knowledge that the blue color would start here, you would have the blue color in here. It would bleed out until something else comes up. But again, this kind of pattern can be compressed very efficiently with JPEG2000, or actually even with JPEG. But we'll get to that in a minute. JPEG has simply less efficiency because it has to include a certain amount of data for each 8x8 pixel block. So there is a minimum amount that you cannot get below even if you have a white or gray page. JPEG2000, just the technicalities to have it in the presentation. It's ISO 15444. And the algorithm relies on a discrete wavelet transformation, which can technically, mathematically be applied in a lossless, reversible fashion. I'm not actually able to go into the details here, but the values that you get out of this, the kind of filtered values, this is similar to JPEG. They are quantized, so if you have a lossy process, you would just simply choose less values in the quantization, and then they are put through an entropy encoder, which would actually take care that consecutive values that are same or similar can be compressed very efficiently. The important thing is you can have it both in a lossless and lossy fashion. So as opposed to standard good old JPEG, this can be used losslessly or lossy. And as Thomas said, it's only supported since PDF 1.5 or PDF A2. So if we generally recommend these days using PDF A2 over PDF A1, that's basically due to the fact that in PDF A1 you would have to use this fallback. You would have to use JPEG, and therefore your compression would be less efficient or your quality would be lower. As for the quality, brief example, it's drastically enough, the differences, that you can actually show it on a projector on a slide. So here you have JPEG that's actually compressed only half as much as the JPEG200 over here. And while it does not show with the characters so much, you really see these JPEG blocking artifacts over here, whereas here you see the typical blur that is an effect of JPEG200 compression. As for JBIG2, that's been in all of the PDF versions since, Thomas helped me out, I think 1.4, but it's really standard now. And as opposed to FACS-G4, which is always lossless, this also allows for lossy and lossless compression. And the concept is basically to apply pattern matching to find recurring symbols. So really to match all the A's and all the B's and all the C's on a page of printed text against each other. Try to identify the ideal middle ground character for each and every representation on the page. And based on that, create a dictionary, compress mostly the small character or symbol bitmaps in the dictionary, and then just store the positions on the page. So what you're effectively doing is trying to recreate the state of the document where you have a typeset document where it basically says, well, that's a Helvetica 10.A at this position. But you're not getting back to this Helvetica point, but you're getting back to the state where you say, well, it's this character bitmap at that position. As an example, this is again from the sample page we had before, and those would be the characters in the dictionary. It's quite well to see here as there is not so much text, but you see, for example, the X, which occurs only once, we didn't put in the dictionary because there is no point in referencing it from there. You can just as well directly compress it in the so-called background bitmap. You have actually different strategies as to how to decompose a page. We know of several implementations of JBIG2, so it would be completely legitimate to cut this frame into several pieces and then reference the pieces of, say, straight lines again and again somewhere. We usually don't do that. We put a lot of things also, no, we don't have them here. If you have small speckles on the document, we would also put them in the background dictionary and not try to compress them separately. Yes?
Is the dictionary per page or?
Again, there are different strategies. You can have a per document dictionary and you can have a per page dictionary. We generally use dictionaries per page because it makes it much easier to merge or separate PDF documents that we generate. If you use a document dictionary, it's usually a bit like using a motion picture codec. It's not really useful to have a dictionary over the entire document because text layouts tend to change, and so you would probably have one for like every 5 or 10 pages and hope to have enough redundancy in the typeset text that it pays off. Otherwise, if you use it over an entire document, it may soon grow too big, and then you have to encode larger references into the dictionary. So there's also always a balance as to how many symbols you have in a dictionary, how long the symbol reference to the dictionary actually becomes, as opposed to directly encoding something. What you can have is you can have cascaded dictionaries referencing each other. So you can have dictionaries of single characters, and then you could have dictionaries of pairs or triplets of characters or other combinations of symbols. but it's also computationally quite intensive to actually compute those dictionaries. For decoding, it's fine. Actually, the standard, like many others, only specifies how to decode the data structures, but you are basically free to apply any kind of pattern matching and optimization and search strategy when coming up with the dictionaries. But we found that there is a last inch of compression that you can squeeze out of a document at an unreasonable computational effort. That's at least our experience there. Okay, just quickly referring to the lossy versus lossless encoding again. For lossless compression, you actually have to encode all the variations. So if there is a difference between this E and that E, and it's only 3 pixels here and there, for a lossless compression, you would have to encode them separately. Still, this is a viable approach. It usually gives you half the size for a black and white image than you would get with standard FACS-G4 encoding, which would just be arithmetic encoding of the entire black and white pattern. So it would be very efficient here and there, but it would not really take a lot of advantage of the structure of the text characters. Okay, a few more things to note about MRC compression with JPEG200, JBIG2. As mentioned, JPEG200 is only available in A2 and A3, but the general approach of MRC compression works with all 3 versions of PDF-A. And since we're not dealing with directly dealing with fonts and metadata and other things here, but we're dealing really with the bitmap content of the page, we are of course also able to create the B and U versions of PDF-A2 and 3. PDF-A1A is a bit of an issue because of course you would have to tag the text properly, and that's really hard to do just based on OCR results. It's usually rather a manual task to actually really live up to that claim. One thing that also needs to be noted: once you start using MRC compression, you can use lossless JPEG200, lossless JBIG2, but you have to be aware that creating or separating a document in these 3 layers and then having a reader compose them again, it's inherently a lossy process. So you would not call it lossless even if the layers in themselves would all be compressed in a lossless fashion. Actually, if you really want lossless compression, what we would recommend is doing a JPEG200 compression of an entire page. It works okay for character content. It works, of course, fine for images or for page backgrounds. And of course, it's not as efficient in terms of compression as the MRC compression. One thing that's not on this page that's also noteworthy, in and of itself, the MRC compression works fine with grayscale and black and white input. Of course, if we get input that's black and white already, we're not trying to make any color layers off of it. We would just use the JPEG2 compression for that page. But then you have these borderline cases where you have a grayscale document which is actually really, or which should be, black and white. And the same, for example, for scanned pages which have been JPEG compressed. So you have these little color artifacts around the edges of the characters, and thereby you have a significant amount of colored pixels in your document. And unless you kind of try to put the toothpaste back into the tube by figuring out, okay, this should be grayscale or this should be black and white, you will have a color document, but the MRC compression would really just basically, ideally it would filter out this color noise, or at least it would suppress it to a very low level. So the vast majority of the information in the MRC compressed document would be in the text layer, and you would have only tiny bits of foreground and background layer information. So it is a very efficient way to deal with that, also with the cases where 90% of your document is actually black and white, and you have this one colored stamp, seal, logo, whatever in one corner, and you want to preserve that color. So that tiny bit of color information would land in the foreground or background layer, and all the rest would really be compressed as text. And yeah, that's kind of along the same lines that Leonard was on in his general talk. Over the years, we've had issues with Adobe rendering our PDFs, or with printers rendering Mrc compressed PDFs. That has kind of I don't know, reached an equilibrium. And the more recent issues we have had are exactly with mobile devices, with Apple Preview, with the viewer in Microsoft Windows 8, and with the recent implementation by Mozilla and Firefox. And we are sending them bug reports, and we are discussing with our customers. And but you have to be aware that some of the issues, or some of the algorithmic structures or rendering algorithms that you need to properly put these 3 layers back together again are typically things that people don't get right in their first approach. That is also due to the fact that depending on the input, we tend to downsample the foreground and background layer information. So you may have less resolution in those layers and only have the full resolution in the text layer. And if someone naively goes and says, well, there's one layer that's only 100 dpi, so I guess 100 dpi is enough for the entire page, then suddenly the document looks much worse than it ought to. And yeah, Apple have recently silently fixed that in their preview versions for iOS 6 and also for the Mac. But I guess older versions are still around where it's broken, whereas, for example, the Adobe Viewer on iOS does it correctly. On the other hand, some recommendations when using this technology. This is really like from our best practices as to what we have learned over the years, what many, many customers with many different types of input have tried and have used successfully. So we would always recommend using Mrc with JPEG200 and JBIG2, really. The results of quality over size are really considerably better than with JPEG and FAXG4. The downside is that it sometimes takes longer to render. That's actually true, but that's kind of an effect of compression in itself. We would always, unless there are really hard cases to be made against it, because you're totally pressed for file size, because you cannot afford the extra compression time or cost for performing the OCR. Unless that's the case, we would really recommend performing OCR while you're at it. It's about 5 to 6 kilobyte per regular printed A4 text page, and the win in terms of usability of the documents afterwards, of being able to copy out text, of being able to index documents, to do full text search, is really, really worth the cost, we think. And it's actually really, for most of our customers, a big selling point for our compression tools, that you can do OCR on the fly and directly embed hidden text into the documents. Yeah, we would really recommend PDF-A to you as an output format. On the one hand, that's really the PDF-A version where you can use JPEG200. On the other hand, we would, of course, always use proper text encoding for the hidden text that we embed, but someone who gets our documents wouldn't necessarily know beforehand. So you have this added measure of extra security in saying, well, it is Unicode and don't worry about it. We also generally recommend using 300 dpi's. Actually, you don't gain so much in compression when using 200 dpi's. Below 200 dpi's, many things actually get hard to, or become hard to read when using scanned document input. Even if you have a high quality scanner, small text tends to be blurred and distorted. And so we recommend 300 dpi. A lot of this is half the amount of pixels as that is on a page, but a lot of that overhead can be compressed out and by our software, but still the documents look a lot better because the JBIG2 matching and also the OCR quality really profit from the higher resolution. On the other hand, many of our customers are now turning towards, or some at least, towards 400 and 600 dpi. And for some use cases, of course, that may be beneficial, but in general, it's not worth the, again, extra compression costs and extra file size. That's our experience. We also recommend lossless encoding of the text layer, so setting the JBIG2 to lossless. We have rare cases where the symbol matching makes kind of dubious decisions. Classic effects are that a 0 becomes substituted by an O, or for example, in certain fonts, the letter L, the small l, is very similar to the printed letter 1, and that can, if you have something like a credit card number or a code or a password or something that's really just text, that can of course become very annoying, that single letters are not clearly identifiable. So we recommend using lossless encoding there, and it's actually, again, not that much overhead over the lossy version. And on the other hand, we have made we've had good experience with lossy encoding of foreground and background layers, and that extends to the point where we actually really downsample those layers, so you only get, I don't know, half or a quarter of the pixels that you would have originally. Then there is another thing that we do in our software, the so-called PDF optimization, and the principle here is that it consumes PDF as input, and of course you can have the classic PDF like a personnel file where you have some typewritten text or some typeset text and graphics, and then you have scanned documents like, I don't know, the scanned application of the candidate or scanned doctor's reports, whatever you have, scanned insurance documents. And suddenly you have a document of 10 pages, and actually the 2 scanned pages at the end make up 90% of the content in the document. Because the regular typeset content with Mrc compression, we usually cannot reduce it by much. Unless it contains weird colored logos or backgrounds, you don't gain much by running this through Mrc compression, and what you actually lose is the ability to print it at any resolution with fine edges and everything. So we generally discourage that. But you could, of course, still run our Mrc compression on the 2 scanned pages towards the end of the document, and that's one of the things that PDF optimization does. It preserves the typeset and vector information, but it optimizes certain objects. So for example, if you have a header image and your PDF output software is bold enough to just put the header image in once for every page, we could identify that and optimize it, and it would run Mrc compression to individual scanned pages. So if really the entire content of one PDF page is just a scanned image, we would do what we regularly do with bitmap input, i.e. run Mrc compression and possibly add OCR information to that page. So yeah, optionally you can do OCR, but it would only be applied to the pages that are really identified as scans and run through Mrc compression. And up to a certain point, we can also convert to PDF-A at that stage. And then we're getting to the more complicated case of born digital conversion. So these days we receive more and more requests where people say, well, we have these and that and those kinds of documents, and we don't really know how many and how much of them and how well structured they are, and we actually don't even really want to look into them, but it would be great to have it all as a PDF-A archive. One case there is also email input, where a lot of the information may be in the attachments to the email, which may be, again, that mixed bag of Office documents. So someone is sending, I don't know, their boss the financial report, and they're sending an Excel sheet, and they're sending a Word file, and they're sending an HTML page, And as it is business communication, you would want to have that in PDF-A for archiving purposes. And what we do, and that's actually again a component where we rely on third-party vendors such as Colors as well, is we more and more focus on the ability to convert those documents, to parse emails. We may implement something to actually not only read emails from EML and MSG files, but to actually pull them off of a server and to properly convert them to PDF-A, where again you have several options. For example, if you have an email with attachments, you can put in everything into the same PDF output file. You could, of course, put them all into separate files within the same folder. You could create a PDF-A2 document with the email body as the main document and all the attachments as individually embedded PDF-A files. So there are a few things to do. And of course, with PDF-A3, you can also embed the original versions of Office documents. So if someone says, well, I would like a PDF-A representation of my Word file, but for some reason I would also like the Word file or the Excel spreadsheet still to be in there, you can add it as an embedded document in PDF-A3, which actually really, again, does not make much sense when doing MRC compression, okay? So adding the TIFF or JPEG original would basically eliminate all the use of the compression for your file would afterwards be even larger than the original file. So we certainly discourage that. And there is the demand to, or increasing demand to add metadata. We offer a certain functionality in terms of forms recognition where you could try to identify things as a date or an invoice number, add that as metadata. Or what we have are customers whose actual business model is, on the one hand, scanning paper documents, on the other hand, capturing index data and compiling surveys or other terms of evaluation of that data and or return it back along with the results of the scanning. And yeah, we've basically had that. PDF-A arbitrary original files can be embedded. Excel spreadsheet would, of course, be a good example, as the Excel spreadsheet can contain formulas which are, of course, no longer there in the printed representation. So generating a PDF from an Excel spreadsheet would be similar to printing it into another digital document, but you would not really get the formula and the macros which may determine some of the content on the page, and which actually in many cases really constitutes the value, the intellectual property value of the Excel spreadsheet, as opposed to the mere numbers that are the results of the computations. And of course, I mean, there is a totally different thread in terms of what to do with CID data, but one way would of course be to print representations as you would print them on paper sheets of your CID model, and then to attach the original CID model with the PDF-A3 file just as well. It's at least one way to tackle this. And we have this special case of Zugpferd. As I think most of you are German, you may be familiar with this. Again, Bernd will elaborate on it in much more detail, but we also have support for this kind of XML representation, where you basically have a printed invoice, which is really what you would get from your supplier or from some company for your utilities or services, and it would contain an XML representation of the invoice data. Whoops. No, this one. Which would look a lot like this. So it would actually contain an invoice number and all the technically all the data entries that you would be able to technically evaluate even with a bookkeeping system on the receiving end. Or in a minimum case, it would contain the banking information that you could use to actually pay that invoice. That is also something that we now offer And there are, of course, various use cases in creating documents where either you have that information from some source, or you can generate it as an additional value while actually compressing scans. So you could even go back and make past invoices Zugpferd compliant if that's what you're aiming for. But with all the things that I have now mentioned, our traditional little small world of, well, I have the scanner, it produces A4 300 dpi full color TIFF images, and how can I effectively convert them to PDF-A? We do now have many more routes to take and many more decisions actually to make along the way. So we have these mixed archives, and basically the overall task would be, the customer says, I'm no longer primarily interested in compression. Actually for bitmaps, compression can be essential because you can really gain by a factor of 50 or 100. So you can really save a lot of storage space. If you convert these kinds of documents, usually compression is no longer so much of an issue because they are kind of well formatted and self-contained. They don't just contain a lot of scanned white pixels. But you have quite a few different things to take care of, especially, for example, if you have PDF input documents and you want to convert them to PDF-A, for example, you have to make sure that font information is correct and that you at least filter out all the ones that primarily contain stuff that is not permitted in PDF-A, or you have to apply some kind of conversion, which can be arbitrarily complicated. And again, where appropriate, you would want to apply OCR and embed files. So again, if you have a PDF document and part of it is properly typeset text, of course it's no use to apply OCR. But then if you have a few scanned pages in between, well, it might be interesting to apply OCR to them and add hidden text there. And what you end up with, in a way, is something like this kind of decision graph, which looks kind of complicated, but there is really no route where you have more than 4 decisions to make. Actually, what's missing here is embedding documents, so that might be a 5th option somewhere. And these two can actually just as well be made by our software as by a user who is looking at the input documents and trying to get an idea. And maybe they're wrong because they're looking at the first 10 documents and the next 100 documents have a totally different structure because they're all PDF, and many people have difficulties in determining whether something is actually text or vector contents, and it can be misleading sometimes. So basically what we're aiming at currently is trying not to totally automate this decision away from users, but to at least support them in making good decisions, or help them with good automated decisions as to how we would process documents, or how the recommendations that we mentioned before can be extended to this whole realm of input documents, which are no longer only scanned documents, but may contain scans here and there just as well. And that brings me to the conclusion here. What we're aiming for right now is keeping the standards that we have achieved with MRC compression and with our general expertise for scanned documents, because really scanning it may be going away at some point, but it's not going away soon. Actually, with desktop scanners being household items these days, for example, insurance companies get lots of emails where people would basically just scan documents that they have, for example, received from a car repair workshop, along with a few photos that they have taken of an accident. And that's actually what the insurance companies offer these days. Send us these documents by email and we'll process them just the same. And what we aim at this point is to provide the values that I have mentioned. We aim for conversion, better and more and higher integrated conversion of further input formats and document types. helping people to make the right decisions there, to actually come up not only with an archive that's all PDF-A, but that's all good PDF-A and containing the right kinds of information, the proper things. We will help our business partner with adding additional data, adding metadata and things that constitute an additional value. Archives, for example, are more and more looking into metadata to actually organize their documents and support retrieval and publishing documents. And we are also working, or we have implemented the file embedding, and we will also, of course, work on the Zugpferd, on getting this standard out to the world and helping it to become more popular and more widespread, because of course with this Zugpferd thing you have a kind of chicken and egg problem. Someone creates such a document and the receiver cannot really actually make use of the XML, then it's no value for them. If the receiver has some kind of way of processing XML attached to PDF-A invoices, but doesn't get those, it's no value for them either. So both sides kind of have to move in unison to advance this standard. Okay, and those are my contact data. If anything applies to you or if you have any further question, of course, feel free to contact us or even just contact us through the support hotline. We try to be very responsive there and try to help you solve your problems in the realms of scanned documents and PDF-A generation in general. Thank you.
So any questions for me?
I have a short question. I think this is a question I often ask. How much does this make the difference between an Mrc using JPEG and fax G4 for a normal business level compared to an Mrc with JPEG200 and JBIG2?
As a rule of thumb, you could say it's another factor of 2.
Factor of 2?
In many cases, yes. Of course, again, if you have this type of information where it's actually really a black and white document, you don't really have much color in there, then that does not necessarily apply. But especially between fax G4 and JBIG2, which tends, for this kind of document, tends to constitute the most content in the text layer. It's really usually a factor of 2. So it really depends on the content. That's also why we offer all our prospects and customers to send us some documents, because there's little surprises here and there. We have technology that works very well over a lot of cases, but in many cases it's hard to exactly predict the outcome of individual settings or of individual options. Yes.
So.
Okay. Is there any limitation concerning the page formats, especially large formats? PDF-A1 supports up to 200-inch. PDF-A2 has no limits.
We fully implement the extended page boundaries of I think PDF 1.7 and PDF-A2, where it was, I don't know what the switch was.
381 kilometers, which is some English.
The practical limitations at this point is really the 32-bit address space. So one of the next things that we'll do is to publish or to release a fully 64-bit compliant version. Also, some of the effects, for example, when you go back to this page, what you see here is that the bleeding always extends from the top to the bottom. So the analysis proceeds through this document in a top to bottom fashion and actually never needs the entire document in memory. And that's one of the principles that we implemented there. So technically speaking, you can compress documents that are too large to fit in memory. Practically, again, the 2 gigabyte address space that we have, that's the greatest boundary. In our SDK, we're already 64-bit compliant, and
you don't support something like tiling, that you try to divide the page into several tiles to compress each tile with the
we don't do that directly. What our algorithm does is rather really process the page in a stripe-wise fashion. All the things such as segmentation can operate in this stripe-wise fashion, and the thing that needs the entire page context is the JBIG2, but at that point you're only dealing with a 1-bit bitmap of the image anymore. And we have discussed this a lot, but actually what we really see as the limiting factor right now is the address space, and that's also critical for the OCR. So basically, once we have an heavy version that's fully 64-bit compliant, we'll also output a PDF compressor version that's 64-bit compliant. And so far, we have been dealing with quite large documents, really. I think we have this that was JPM, but it was this Japanese wall painting map of 5 by 2 meters or something. Yeah.
Okay, I know some images which are larger.
Sure, and we'll of course always or from our support calls we are basically aware of what the boundary is of what's currently possible, and we may end up introducing tiling, but tiling usually produces artifacts that we consider ugly. It's hard to avoid tiling artifacts where you cut between the tiles. You actually, once you know about it, you see those tend to see those artifacts directly where they occur.
We have another one? Okay.
Okay, maybe say something, talk about your experience, particularly in manufacturing, where PDF-A3 is used for archiving in combination with maybe attachments. You provided an example where cat data, 3D data, for instance, can also be embedded as an attachment within a PDF document. Do you have an experience there as a state-of-the-art already?
I wouldn't know that we directly supply this to anyone, but on the other hand, in the PDF compressor, we supply this as a basic functionality. So you can basically say compress or convert this file to PDF, and while you're at it, please add this file and those and those. So people would not necessarily have to tell us what they are embedding.
So we discussed yesterday was the first one, so this was the most innovative. This is not best practice. So PDF-A3 is brand new from last October, and now we see, and also I think at least I'm in the learning curve. So every day I have a new use case or application area for PDF-A3.
Okay.
And this was one, but as I said, the customer itself said it would be good for me to have a PDF, the long-term safe PDF-A for archiving. So we have the archiving track, and I would like to put my DWG, which is the AutoCAD in there, but that's not in production yet.
Okay.
One thing really, or basically two things come to mind, where the one thing is really something like the Microsoft Office format or some kind of proprietary format where you say, okay, the PDF version is really the fixed version for archiving, but if someone wants to go back and maybe make a copy of that document or whatever and process it further or port it to a new format or something, then I have the original attached. And the other thing is really attaching some kind of machine readable format, for example, an XML format that is an alternative representation where the invoice letter is directed towards a human and the XML is directed towards a system, but both want to see and process the same types of information. That's basically two directions we see currently.
Okay, thank you, Armin.
Oh, I've got one more. In the real world, out of all the PDF-A standards, 180 to 3, for which one do you get the most demand from your customers? And is there a difference between the public sector and the private sector? What do people really use?
That's almost a question I would direct towards Thomas Stellmann, because he probably knows more about it than I do.
Our experience is that let's say the people who started with PDF-A part 1 stay with that, and especially in the scan area. The new ones, like Armin presented, when they start new projects, then very often PDF-A2 is best practice due to JPEG200, due to PDF-A2U to have a safe Unicode representation. And PDF-A3 is brand new, so that's, no. So
and also,
even if Bernd will talk about this Zugwert, where we embed this invoicing, this is not in production yet. So it was just in the beginning of June that the final or the version was released, and now companies, ERP systems can start to create invoices as PDF-A3 files. But this also no, I'm not aware of a productive PDF-A3 customer today. But which will come. So as I said, there's also really a learning curve, and we see this also in other seminars that the people are now collecting ideas. We're discussing with them what could be good applications, useful applications, use cases for PDF-A3, but then it takes time to really deploy it in a customer side in production.
Also, one must again note, I mean, most of us are probably aware that really the one difference between PDF-A2 and PDF-A3, that in A2 you could embed documents, but they had to be PDF-A documents, whereas in 3 you can embed any kind of document. You can embed a regular PDF, you can embed a Word file, you can embed an XML file, and you can embed arbitrarily many of them. And yeah, as Thomas said, probably the use cases are just about beginning to form around that.
As if we meet in 1 year, this will look different, the situation, for sure. I'm very optimistic, but it's just a statement. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.